Thanks for coming. We're going to start today's first session, and our first speaker today is. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear? Okay. So thanks. We're going to start today's first session. I'm very pleased to welcome Mladen Dolar, who I'm sure you all know. This is Mladen's third visit to Beirut. He gave a couple of seminars at AUB on Monday and Wednesday. Mladen is a professor and senior researcher at the University of Ljubljana, the author of many, many books, over 11 in Slovenian, 3 in English, more, published by MIT in 2006. He has a forthcoming book with Duke University Press entitled The Riskiest Moment, and a collection of essays published over the past 15 years in different places will be collected together and published by Bloomsbury Academic, hopefully soon. He's also, what he's going to present today, his talk today is entitled Where Does Power Come From? And this is the working title for another book that he's currently working on, which hopefully will appear with MIT sometime soon. So thanks, Mladen. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, Nadia, Surti, for organizing this. Thank you, Mellon. Thank you, the Global South. Okay. Well, this sounds like an impossibly ambitious title, like where does the power come from? I will not even attempt to answer the question of the title or give some overarching overview of the psychoanalytic accounts of the origins of power. I'm not crazy. Or at least I'm not that crazy. I will give a few reflections on the present predicament of power, the particular constellation we are confronted with, the particular type of master figures that we are now facing daily. I'm interested in one simple turn, actually, and the emphasis of devising an opposition to that. And I will take my entry point through the concept of ideology. But before that, I will nevertheless begin with a sort of reminder of the particular placement of psychoanalysis in relation to modern development of the structures of power and the modern underpinnings of authority. And of course, there was a reflection on the origins of power at the core of psychoanalysis since the beginning. But this reflection was intimately, extimately tied up with a particular historic moment. And since I have been giving a seminar on authority here in Beirut, and my talk here is in the conference is kind of a continuation of that seminar, but taking it in a different direction, I can nevertheless start with the simplest, something I was talking about in a seminar, the simplest sentence by Hannah Arendt from her well-known essay on what is authority, where first she immediately translates the question of what is authority into what was authority, and I quote just one sentence: authority has vanished from the modern world. We can no longer fall back upon authentic and undisputable experiences common to all. And this is what for her defines modernity. Authority is gone. We live in a time of a crisis of authority. And this is like the shortest definition of modernity, of the modern predicament. There once were times where true authority ruled supreme, but the good old times or bad old times, so take your pick, are gone. So this may be seen either as a downfall, a loss, or an emancipation and a blessing. But the predicament behind this regarding authority persists. And, well, to put it as simplest, first, the advent of psychoanalysis, to make it very short, exactly corresponds to this crisis of authority. The downfall of traditional authorities is its starting point. it corresponds to and intervenes into the crisis of authority and works through the crisis of authority. And thus, adding to the authorities of the master and the teacher, which define the two impossible professions of governance and education, a third kind of authority, that of the analyst, the third impossible profession, an authority whose aim is to work through the springs of authority and to deconstruct itself, as it were. But the fact that authority is gone from the modern world doesn't imply that we are happily or unhappily done with it, but quite the contrary, that we have to deal with various kinds of new master figures, which are now premised on the downfall of the traditional authorities. They may look like fake masters or imposters or upstarts or parodies of a master, but this doesn't make them less dangerous or pernicious, but quite the opposite. I will briefly evoke this telling anecdote. I used it in the summer school in Ljubljana. Some of you were there. I mean, of Freud's one memorable visit to Slovenia in April 1898, when he was writing the Trondheim. And this is a story which is worth telling in more detail or whatever. I will not do this here. It's an emblematic story. I can just use it very, very briefly. Namely, when Freud was visiting this famous cave in Slovenia, at the very bottom of that cave, in the Inferno, and he himself compared this to this trip as a descent into hell, he met Dr. Karl Lueger, who was at the time the Burgomaster of Vienna, and by coincidence he was visiting the same cave. And who was this Lueger fellow? Why is this important? Why is this emblematic? He was, well, the Burgomaster at the time, the head of the Christian Social Party, a very popular and populist leader. I will come back to that. And one can find the best clue to his significance in Hitler's Mein Kampf, because the young Hitler spent his youthful years roaming the streets of Vienna, and in Mein Kampf he describes how he had at the time the great model, the great ego ideal, the great source of inspiration, the greatest German Burgomaster of all times, the genius of a Burgomaster, and the biggest promoter of anti-Semitism. So Lueger was the one that for Hitler opened his eyes to the nature of Jews, and he praised his ability to stir up the feelings of the masses, to have this mass appeal beyond the untrustworthy, the treacherous parliamentary politicians. And it was from him that Hitler learned everything he needed to know about anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, the significant thing is that Lueger is in all literature persistently now referred to as, qualified as a populist leader, evoking a new brand of political movement against the background of political traditional parties and the rise of social democracy, etc. So it's not merely his anti-Semitism, but the era of populism which was inaugurated there. And the term populism actually stems exactly from that period. The term that gained it academic currency in the 60s, and then, Carlos mentioned Nestor Laclau, who proposed the theory of populism in the 70s, and it's followed now by today's avalanche. But the important thing is it's precisely at that moment that the very idea of populism arose as a political reality. And Freud was notoriously not interested in politics, but here we have a first massive immediate confrontation with a political figure, and not a traditional master figure based on paternal authority, the name of the father, S1, etc. The first confrontation of Freud with political authority involves this new and sinister type of authority, a break with the traditional figures of sovereignty. And this new type will then have various avatars through the century, up to the present surge of populism. So psychoanalysis has to be placed precisely within this break, and its birthplace is marked by this surge of the new logic of the political. Okay, the signifier at work here, Lueger, Lügner, liar in Germany, so the very name designates that this is the sort of the fakery, the treacherous S1, the treacherous S1. And I'll just make one further comment on Weger, which is kind of interesting, which makes it emblematic. Namely, his anti-Semitism was so notorious at the time that when he got elected in 1895, the Emperor Franz Joseph refused to appoint him. And Freud says somewhere that this was the occasion he celebrated with an extra cigar. And the emperor actually refused to appoint him 3 more times. The emperor refused to appoint him 4 times. And eventually he had to give in to the democratic will of people, actually after the intercession of the Pope, Leon XIII. So what is emblematic about this? Because why did the emperor refuse to nominate this Weger fellow? Of course, he had good conservative reasons for that. He wanted Vienna to be ruled by nice aristocrats like himself, not by upstarts and troublemakers, stirring up all these emotions of the masses. But there was a sort of conservative instinct in this, namely to oppose any politics contravening against common decency and civility, and transgressing particularly the unwritten rules, which actually hold society together. This is what Hegel summed up by the word Sittlichkeit. So we can see in this the Emperor Franz Joseph, in the Emperor largely the last version of the monarchic father figure, the last cry of the old sovereignty, the swan song of the old sovereignty, the embodiment of authority and stability. And I will just remind that Franz Joseph ruled for 68 years, and he is outdone in his tenure only by Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and currently by Elizabeth II. So there are only 2 rulers who kind of ruled for a longer period. So it's the last father. Just before the downfall of the father, he made this last valiant, insistent attempt to stop this new logic, but to no avail. So this is the paradigm shift, the last father king. And when Freud was born under the rule of Franz Joseph, and when Franz Joseph died, Freud was 50, so he spent the large part of his life under this rule. So this is what makes it a sort of emblematic image in inaugurating the century. And of course it's not just that there is a new type of master figure, the populist. And if I link this a bit quickly to Alenka's talk yesterday, this is already the time when what you call the surplus systemic enjoyment, or this useless excess, already accumulated to the point of threatening with a break, a disruption. And populism emerged precisely as a mechanism of binding that surplus in order to keep the order, the repression in place. And indeed, the cumulative disrupting surplus led to the point of the World War I. Alenka mentioned the World War II as this catastrophic event, but actually the same logic was already in place leading up to World War I. And to be followed then by the exacerbation of the same process leading to World War II. And one can see the continuity with Hitler precisely continuing that logic that he learned from Karl Weger. So the pupil surpassing the master. So the same thing just was accumulated even more, exacerbated even more. Now, another way of putting it, all theories of authority have to deal with the fact that traditionally it was the paternal authority which served as a sort of natural model for all authority. And the idea seems to impose itself self-evidently. I was speaking about in the seminar. The child is helpless, immature, so he or she needs guidance, authority to be brought to the level of culture, civilization, the entry into culture. So there is spontaneously at hand the parental and specifically paternal authority, the instance which presents the natural embodiment of authority. and based in a sort of pre-political realm of family and education. And from there, it can be extended as a model for the political authority. This is already the step that, for instance, you have in the basic step in Aristotle. Now there is a sort of paradox with psychoanalysis, since Freud, with his insistence on Oedipus as the core of subject formation, the basic impulse of human desire and the access to the law most tellingly placed under the banner of the name of the father. So Freud, psychoanalysis, seems to prolong this age-old story and just give it a more sophisticated twist. And this is, for instance, at the core of the criticism presented by Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus, the nomadic nature of desire being reduced to the story of mommy and daddy in psychoanalysis. So, can one say that Freud presents the father as the source of every authority, and thus the clue to any political authority? So does Freud just prolong this age-old, very venerable strand of thought? This was precisely this traditional view, but this is precisely what is now put to scrutiny, and the basic point is that rather Freud discerns the function of the father and its vicissitudes precisely at the time when this traditional account has historically lost its way. And this is why I was suggesting that this Freud meeting Klueger in Slovene underground presents an emblematic moment, the decline of traditional authority, and everything that Freud says regarding the father, and then Lacan about the name of the father, has to be placed in this perspective. It's not about extolling the father as the heart kernel of authority, but taking stock of the father function after its demise. This is the basic problem in psychoanalysis. And to be sure, that Freud proposed his myth of the murder of the father, the dead father, ruling as the name of the father, as a symbolic authority, as the authority of the symbolic. And I've written already about this, so I proposed this short formula for the advent of modernity, namely that it was the dead father himself who died. It's not. It's the dead father who had this, who was the clue to authority throughout history. The dead father died. He lost the symbolic impact. His name stopped being the foundation of authority. It was revealed as an imposture. So fathers, both real and symbolic, lost their power, which could be then retroactively seen as ridden with imposture from the outset. So this massive rhetoric, this massive historic presupposition made it possible for Freud to discern the father not as a source of authority, but in the contingency of his function. And it's not that fathers and rulers, whatever, could no longer measure up to this function. It's the symbolic function itself that has lost the power of measure. So, the outburst of joy at this dwindling of authority would be premature, and this is one of the stakes in Freud's group psychology, and what comes after the overthrow of kings and decline of this paternal symbolic authority is not a happy spread of triumphant democracy, but the rise of this underside of the symbolic father, which can be, on the one hand, linked to the psychoanalytic notion of the superego, and coterminous with the advent of these new master figures, which can be put under the heading of populism. And Lacan has this, he has a knack for simplicity, the knack for inventing very simple slogans, and one of the slogans is Père ou pire, father or worse. So paternal rule was bad enough, but we are heading for worse. I mean, being rid of it, we are heading for worse. And at all times, I think we need to underpin Freud with this historical background that he always avoided, but he never stopped. This never stopped him from taking stock of it in the most perceptive and lucid way, surpassing actually all those who swear by historicity and historization. And, well, I would just mention a footnote that, of course, different vocabularies can be used for this. And, for instance, the Foucauldian vocabulary of biopolitics is something which is actually analogous or parallel to this logic. And Foucault criticizes psychoanalysis without realizing the proximity of his own project to the Freudian project, that this could be actually brought together. Or still another way of putting it, and I'm now coming closer to my topic actually. You know, there is a notorious adage of the Lacanian psychoanalysis that the big other doesn't exist, and Lacan never tired of repeating it in one way or another. And here is one of his last pronouncements, actually in 1980, which I like particularly. He says, "L'autre manque, the other lacks. Ça me fait drôle à moi aussi." I love this. I don't feel happy about it myself. L'autre manque, ça me fait drôle à moi aussi. Je tiens le coup pourtant, yet I endure, ce qui vous épate, mais je ne le fais pour cela. Je ne le fais pas pour cela. Which fascinates you, but I am not doing it for that reason. Now, the curious thing is that this adage doesn't seem to be subversive or scandalous at all. Actually, it can be taken as a kind of slogan of present times, the sort of generally accepted diagnosis, a shorthand, the process of decline, of the dwindling of the big other, the decline that authority implied. So it can be taken as another way of saying that authority has vanished in our times. No more fathers, no more sovereigns, no more religion, transcendental guarantees, moral laws, no more public. The public that Kant so optimistically relied on for the spread of the enlightened reason. I was talking about this a couple of days ago. So, and no more belief that reason would prevail, the belief that linked Kant to Freud. So saying that the big other doesn't exist, isn't it stating the obvious? So one could summarize this paradox like this: why are you telling me that the big other doesn't exist when we know full well that the other doesn't exist? So the question is, how come that in the times when the big other doesn't exist, and this is a sort of generally accepted wisdom, it doesn't need Lacan to tell us this, as it were, why is it that the big other nevertheless rules supreme, that it's intractable, it's intact? Okay. Now this was a sort of introduction, and I'm coming to my topic. I said I would approach this problem through the spyglass of ideology, and this is one thing I also prepared for the seminar, but we never got there. And it's another notoriously tricky concept. Ideology, like being in Aristotle, can be spoken of in ever so many ways. We have this one word, but a babel of tongues. And like with Aristotle, the question arises whether we are dealing with various senses of the same entity, which persists through these different uses, or whether different senses point to various kinds of entities. And there are dozens of proposed definitions of ideology. One is always on a shifting ground. One is always doomed to arbitrary entry points. And with this risk, this caveat in mind, I will propose one very simple line, which is again a sort of, a big narrative of modernity and how we got to the point where we are now. And I will give a purposely naive kind of narrative, namely that one of philosophy's crucial goals and ambitions, since its inception and throughout its history, was at the simplest to do away with delusions. And given the propensity of human mind to fall prey to illusions of all kinds, one should then devise strategies to counteract it, to undo the illusory enchantment and to lift the veil, to unmask. This was already to see straight. This was the principal task that philosophy set for itself at the outset. And one can invoke things like the divide between mythos and logos, the adage know thyself, and raising the questions of validity of epistemic truth claims, the foundations of moral injunctions. It all boils down to this: let's lift the illusions, let's lift the veil and go look at the real thing. And the moment of its beginnings, well, are often described as the Greek Enlightenment in the 6th century, in order to put it in parallel and analogy with the 18th century Enlightenment, the era that invented the name Enlightenment for that process, but the process which was always already there. And Foucault, proposed this idea that Enlightenment is unique precisely for having named itself and defined the era which defined itself, its historic mission. Enlightenment knew that it was enlightenment, while, the Middle Ages didn't know they were middle. So the historic circumstances may be radically different. There's a couple of millennia apart, but the project was driven by the same ambition. This historic moment was mirroring the former one and bringing it to a completion. The idea of doing, with the victory of the Enlightenment, doing away with delusions. This is, of course, a very simplified way of telling this story. That both sides were ridden with endless detours. There's a shifting complexities of envisaged delusions, misconceptions, fallacies, chimeras, and the intricacies of rational means, arguments, logical tools, the invention of ever new reasons how to tackle them, and this is the massive difference in historic moments and social backgrounds, but I'm using this sort of naive entry point for a particular end, namely, if enlightenment in this larger sense saw itself as the undoing of illusions, of the self-incurred immaturity, to use Kant's famous parlance, and if it eventually triumphed with the advent of modernity, then this is precisely the inaugurational moment of ideology. So the moment we say ideology, we have set ourselves apart from that logic, the Enlightenment logic from the Greek times to Enlightenment of doing away with delusions. And ideology essentially pertains to modernity. The term itself emerged immediately after the French Revolution. It's notoriously in 1796 that Destutt de Tracy proposed the term ideology as a science of ideas. And this is what you have in all textbooks. And it could be conceived at a historical juncture between when the originary Enlightenment ambition of philosophy has run its course and come to a completion, when it won the alleged victory, this watershed beyond which we are supposedly modern, and ideology as a modern entity as such has bid farewell to combating the old-time chimeras and superstitions, the unveiling of the true reality behind the delusions. And Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, treated the logic of this combat under the general heading of the struggle of the Enlightenment with superstition. So we've done with superstition. And the whole problem is that ideological illusions in this new constellation are now part and parcel of the real world that is supposed to stand hidden behind the veil. It's now the real world that produces illusions, sustains them at its core, and keeps them at its bosom. It's not just a matter of deluded consciousness. The very reality of this world becomes questionable. The mask appears to blend with the face it was supposed to mask, and this is what separates ideology from the run-of-the-mill human propensity for delusions. And the world itself, in its hard reality, appears to be structured as ideology. It's no longer the matter of consciousness, its whims that should be debunked, delusions lifted, The delusion is ingrained in the very structure. So the ideological distortion is inherent part of this reality itself, not just of consciousness. And critique of ideology has thus a much harder task than the classical philosophical endeavors, if I put them under this simplified banner, from Thales to Kant. It demands a sort of double reflection. The veil that obfuscated reality is shifted and located within this reality itself. This is what the term ideology means. And now this shift was highlighted by Marx in the very first sentences, actually, of the preface to German Ideology, this manuscript of 1845, which inaugurated the proper concept of ideology, this, the most important strand of this concept. And there he says, very briefly, hitherto men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves, about what they are and what they ought to be. The phantoms of their brains have got out of their hands. They, the creators, have bowed down before their creations. Let us liberate them from chimeras, the ideas, dogmas, imaginary beings, under the yoke of which they are pining down. Let us teach men, says one, to exchange these imaginations for thoughts which correspond with the essence of man, says the second, to take up a critical attitude to them, says the third, to knock them out of the head, and existing reality will collapse. This is like a summary, and now comes Marx's coup de force. These innocent and childish fancies are the kernel of the modern young Hegelian philosophy. So it's like a rhetorical good rhetorical figure, good rhetorical coup, what is first presented as a sort of critical stance, which is readily accepted as the sort of result of the Enlightenment, is then exposed precisely as childish fancies. So what is ideological about German ideologists is belonging to this radical group of young Hegelians to which Marx and Engels were initially part of. The ideological streak in them is precisely they don't have the concept of ideology. And they continue the struggle against chimeras, dogmas, delusions, according to the pattern of this debunking of illusions, still the Enlightenment pattern. Dismantle the illusions and the world will crumble, domination will come to an end. As opposed to this, there is a new task of what can now properly be called critique, as opposed to debunking, and critique bearing on ideology as opposed to illusions, and thus pursuing and radicalizing the notion of critique, which was proposed by Kant. And there you have then the long tradition of critical theory, and with the critique of ideology, and the moment one says ideology, one says critique of ideology. So it immediately calls for critique. There is no neutral objective description, or any such description aims at dismantling its object. Its object is its foe. But as opposed to all kinds of delusions, the deception involved in ideology is structurally necessary. It's inveterate. It stems with necessity from a certain condition of the world and sustains this condition. And what is ultimately required is changing this condition. It's the world which necessitates, inevitably produces illusions. And can only function so long as they are maintained. So falsity pertains to the world. It doesn't pertain to the consciousness. And if Marx says false consciousness, it's a consciousness of a false world. So there's this duplicity of reality itself. And so the traditional unveiling will never do against these odds. And the Enlightenment idea that people will abandon delusions once they see light turns out to be itself the greatest delusion. This is the paramount case of ideology, precisely this type of thinking. Let people be rid of delusions and then we'll be fine. Okay, this shift, one way of looking at it is that this shift affects the standard assumptions about truth and lie. And the standard test of truth and falsity of a statement was supposed to accord with the cat is on the mat model, we have a statement, and all we have to do is to look if the cat is really on the mat or fooling around in the garden. And if we find it curled on the mat, then the statement is true. But with ideology, ideology of course involves falsity, but it doesn't thereby fall into the realm of lying or intentional deception or fraud. And there is never any lack of this, but this is a sort of naive notion of ideology. The key dimension is neither epistemic nor moral nor psychological nor propagandistic, but structural. It doesn't simply consist of false statements about reality, which could be exposed by comparison with the true state of affairs. Ideology proper starts when it is not the statements that are false, but the reality itself which should serve as a yardstick of the judgment. So it gets hold of the subjects only when they perceive something as objective reality, independent of propositions one may form about it. It is the most ideological when it succeeds to present the perceived reality as something utterly non-ideological. And this is what happens with, I was speaking about this briefly in the seminar about the notion of economy, which is taken as this hard objective reality, the hard reality of reference of the present world, the discourse of market economy and its spread. And ideology consists precisely in presenting the advancement of this economy as the ultimate horizon of the thinkable and available. And in this respect, then, left-wing and right-wing politics differ not in substance but in degree. Should one regulate this objective reality, or should one deregulate this self-propelling force? To what extent one should attenuate it by social concerns, human rights, etc., or give it free rein? So it's like difference of degree, not of substance, where the left increasingly looks like the right with a more human face. So the success of ideology is to present something as an objective force, inexorable, something that can be only canalized and restrained or encouraged, released, but there is a troubling consensus at the bottom. So the lie doesn't pertain so much to statements about it, but to reality itself, which is set up as the measure of truth value. And one can say that in this particular case, economy is not a statement about economy, it's the cat on the mat itself. You present something as the cat on the mat, not the question of the truth of the statements, not the ideas one may entertain about it. And anyone who maintains that the cat is not on the mat automatically runs the risk of being labeled as blinded by ideology. Still, now I'm coming to slowly to my particular point. This doesn't do away with the call for unveiling, for unmasking, but it makes it doubly difficult. It requires a redoubled unveiling, not just on the part of consciousness, but on part of reality. It's not enough to disclose the reality behind the veil of deception, but since reality itself turns out to be structured as a lure. But the lure, still involves a disguise, a kind of reflected one. It still calls for a great effort of the critique of ideology to undo this ideological facade and to exhibit its symptoms. Strenuous efforts are demanded for this. But now what I'm really interested in, this I'm coming to my point, is something which is quite opposite, namely a strange turn that we are witnessing recently, and which seems to present a new stage of this ideology, namely that the hard work of ideology critique is done by the apparent self-unveiling of this, self-unmasking of this official front itself. Not the difficult analysis of what lies behind the ideological lure, but the coming out of this underside itself. Okay, I will take a detour through Brecht. who invented an ingenious mechanism of ideology critique, the notorious Verfremdungseffect, the effect of estrangement. What does estrangement consist of? One can imagine a Brechtian situation when a fat capitalist comes on stage and without further ado says, I am a capitalist, my only interest is to squeeze workers as much as I can, to make them toil as hard as possible, and to pay them as little as possible. I only care about my profits. And one can recognize this as a sort of Brechtian situation. Okay, it appears in slightly various, different kinds of guises, but this is a sort of Brechtian situation, namely a character who blatantly and shamelessly states his business in completely undisguised form, without any illusions or deceit. And the strangeness, the estrangement effect of this is that resides in the impossibility of it actually ever being stated bluntly and publicly. It being stated publicly and without disguise would actually make it inoperative. It couldn't effectively constitute the social bond on which modern exploitation is based. Because ideology in this way consists in the pursuit of interest which must be hidden behind the facade of common values, the universality of human rights, the love for humanity, the progress, etc., general prosperity, democracy, all this. So there is a necessary appearance and the blunt statement of interest which behind it, which stages the impossibility of exposure of this underside in a plain manner. So there is interest and their concealment. They can only exist and thrive by being transposed in a different kind of discourse which covers them with a cloak of universal values. And the Brechtian step is to unveil the actual driving force behind the high ideas and pin all ideas to their actual driving forces. Now, the strange thing is that such a proclamation doesn't look strange any longer. This is the real estrangement. It is as if the estrangement effect doesn't work. Certain ways of blunt talk have actually become conceivable, admissible, acceptable in public speech. So this intended dialectics of brute interests and their concealment doesn't function. And okay, if one needs to give a name to this shift, I think it occurred, it started occurring in the last decades, in the 80s, with the ascendancy of the neoliberal discourse, and one of these emblematic statements in the 80s was, greed is good. Suddenly it was okay to say, greed is good. This was a simple and trivial slogan which encapsulated a certain moment in the 80s, promoting to the rank of commonly acceptable general truth about this, the greed being good, being put in plain sight. And the cynicism of Brecht's characters ceased to look cynical. It lost the force to produce estrangement. There is no more estrangement, and the Verfremdungs effect of today, I think, its principal resource is the very lack of Verfremdung. It doesn't seem strange any longer. So this is a short slogan, from estrangement effect to estrangement defect. Okay. But this was only a beginning in view of what was to follow in the present-day populist turn, and now we have this outspokenly obscene discourse. What happened in the 80s seems like a nutshell to the spectacular dimensions that we now have a quarter of a century later, like beyond the limits of what was then conceivable, and one may take obscenity as a sort of an entry point, or a makeshift clue to this new turn. And what is obscene, and I would be tempted to bring its definition in line with exactly Freud's designation of the uncanny. And this addresses precisely our problem of extimacy. Extimacy was intended originally as the translation of das Unheimliche, and at the minimal, something comes to the fore that should have remained hidden. This is this minimal definition. One sees something that shouldn't have been seen. And this is actually, curiously, Schelling's definition of the uncanny that Freud quotes and approves of. I quote this Schelling, Freud quoting Schelling, "Uncanny is what one calls everything that was meant to remain secret and hidden and has come into the open." And Freud also points to the vicinity of the uncanny and the comical, and this thin line separating the two. And now the obscene. It's another avatar, it's a new shift, it's a transformation of this notion of the uncanny, of this extimate notion. Something comes to light that should have remained hidden, but what happens? How to qualify this? Now, of course, there's a certain moment of anxiety when this happens, although it's rather turned into, indignation, and there is a sort of comical effect. And with these new rulers, one constantly speaks of buffoonery, clownishness, whatever. So, but laughter gets stuck in the throat. And I think the best comment on this was actually done by Terry Gilliam, Terry Gilliam of Monty Python fame, who said, "Not even the Pythons in the best days could match the surreal madcap nature of this presidency." And the reality is funnier than anything one can do. And this was published in The Guardian under the title, "Donald Trump is funnier than Monty Python," says Terry Gilliam. So we were trying hard, with Monty Python in the 70s, etc. But this is much better. This surpasses. We couldn't have thought of that. No? This is beyond the capacities of Monty Python. And there is then another dimension in this mix, which is the dimension of shame and shamelessness. Shame also involves something coming to light that shouldn't have. But there is a sort of reflected shame, the shame that one feels at the shamelessness of the exposure of the other. And particularly when shamelessness is actually promoted presented as an act of liberation. So you have all these things in the mix, the uncanny, the comical, the shameful, that intersect in the obscene, and they produce an enigmatic, a troubling effect which remains enigmatic and which is a mixture of outrage, perplexity, disgrace, disbelief, puzzlement, amusement, and horror. I don't quite know what name to put to this, but this is the effect that we are now kind of daily experiencing. So what should have been hidden has come to light. But what is it? Is it a truth that comes to the fore with this exposure of the hidden? Of course, there would be an ultimate irony in this. There's a truth coming out as obscenity. But this is not at all what is at stake. And to be sure, there was always an obscene side to power. There was always its shameful hidden, it always had its shameful hidden secrets. There was always this blunt self-interest behind the pretense of ideals. There was always this narcissistic megalomania, the vulgarity, but which is now put on brazen display. There was this petty envy, childish spite, jealousy, malice. But if all this comes to the fore, are we finally seeing the truth uncovered, unveiled, without dissimulation? Is this the hidden truth that ideology tries to cover up with its construction of reality, with this inner veil of reality? Well, anything but. It's quite the contrary. This is the point where I was slowly driving to. What we see is just another lure, another fake, not some truth, but actually a more insidious lure. It's a sort of meta lure, precisely because it's shamelessly displayed. Obscenity is not the mark of truth, it is the way that the very unveiling starts functioning as a veil. Everything is shown, but the very unveiling starts functioning as a veil. The shadowy double does it apparent coming out, and starts acting as the biggest boost of ideology. By exposing the hidden interior that shouldn't come to light, which is the structural feature of extimacy, it presents the lure which is the furthest away from this critical potential of the very notion of, very concept of extimacy. Now, philosophy has been haunted by the liar paradox since its inception. You know that Epimenides, the Cretan liar, was actually Thales's contemporary, and it has devoted a lot of reflection to its intricacies and the ways to avoid its clutches. But now it seems that we have to do with this whole new dimension, new avatar of the liar paradox, a sort of its redoubling, or a kind of meta-liar paradox. Like most massively, a person holding the highest office can tell 1,000, 10, 15,000 lies without this having any consequence. Everybody knows them to be lies. They're easily verifiable. They can be checked against simple and commonly available facts. So there is no need for convoluted interpretations, no need for sophisticated conceptual means developed by critique of ideology to debunk some subtle fallacies behind a facade of seeming accuracy and objectivity. Now it would seem that the simplest cat on the mat test will suffice, without going to the length of examining the falsity of the cat. It is as if the object of analysis would itself present its own devastating critique in the face of the hapless critics of ideology. It's like ideology unmasking itself. So the emperor may take all of his clothes, and the people may cry, "Emperor is naked," pointing out the obvious, but to no avail. And I think even more, the emperor himself proudly cries, "Look, I'm naked." And I think most of Trump's pronouncements can actually be spelled out like this, reduced to this: "Look, I'm naked." And this being, so he's always in advance of the outrage critics. And this again has the structure of this Freudian joke or meta joke. Why are you so massively demonstrating to me that power is obscene, where I know full well that power is obscene? So why are you lying to me? I mean, lying in this reflected manner, not lying by the facts that can be, the lies that can be checked against the facts. And well, it may seem that the signifier Trump condenses all this most economically, but the process hasn't started with Trump, and he is rather a product of a shift that was decades in the making. And I will just mention two massive things. If one considers drastic facts being on full display without this having any consequences, one can remind that nobody was ever held accountable for the biggest economic crisis in Western history, with an unprecedented massive state intervention to bail out the culprits, which was then put on the shoulders of the population. And nobody was ever held accountable for starting the Iraq War on the basis of a blatant lie, with catastrophic consequences with no end in sight. To take just two things, extremely obvious and most obvious things. And one should start there, say with the reasons for that economic crash, prepared by decades of neoliberal policies, not with the fascination with Trump. He's a product of this. Now, it looks like ideology, this reflected form, has done its coming out, thus putting the vigilant and perspicacious critics of ideology out of job. What remains for them to do if their object reveals itself in full view and displays what should be laboriously excavated? Are we confronted with a truth that was distorted and disguised under the cloak of ideology? And this is the crux of the matter. The new turn that I am trying to pursue in its simplest forms is the mechanism by which lifting the illusion actually heightens and enhances the illusion. The lifting of the veil turns into the most obdurate veil, and this new twist is that the best way to hide is to be, well, hidden in full view, in plain sight, in full spotlight, in front of the world audience and daily. And this looks like a new avatar of the post-purloined letter, with the addition that it bears the inscription, "This is the purloined letter." Still nobody finds it, or even better, everybody finds it and reads it, and it has no consequences. Or even better, in the post story, the queen, whose reputation was at stake and threatened by the discovery, the disclosure of this purloined letter, the queen tweets this letter on her Twitter account. I think that would be the new sort of version of the post purloined letter. So the utter obfuscation coincides with the coming out of the hidden. And Freudianly speaking, this may look like lifting the repression, with all this most childish and primitive impetus is coming to light, but it's the very opposite. It's the repression that gets repressed. It's the repression itself that gets repressed. This, I think, is the simplest diagnosis qualifying the present moment, the astounding degree to which repression itself gets repressed. And one can be, I'm at the end, just a few minutes. One can be reminded of Freud in the Traumdeutung. At some point he says that sometimes one has to deal with dreams which are faultlessly logical and reasonable. He says these are the toughest cases to interpret. They appear to have a meaning, but that meaning is as far removed as possible from their true significance. I quote Freud. So they appear not to be in need of interpretation because everything is plainly laid out. This is the toughest nut to crack. This kind of situation. The biggest delusion pertains to what evidently makes sense and apparently needs no interpretation. So, my final point, 2 points. Maybe it was always so to some degree, in some dimension. So it's naive to think that once there were true masters, the proper S1, well, now we have all these parodies and impersonators. Maybe there never was a time of an innocent and immediate sort of impact of figures of mastery. Master was always an imposter. But there is certainly a shift that occurred when this side dimension, the obscene side dimension, virtually became the main show. Where the ineptitude, the banality, this merger of the corporate private business with state sovereignty can directly function as a boost, a lever of an overwhelming show that holds the worldly audience in awe. So S1 is a fake, and everybody knows it, including itself. But this doesn't stop it from functioning. Quite the opposite. This turns to be the internal condition of its functioning. And it's like displaying that the big other doesn't exist and getting a resource of power precisely from that's boosting the big other. And another way of putting it, there is a mechanism by which authority starts thriving precisely on its own breakdown. The more it's fake, the better it functions. And to bring it to the formula, I proposed this already at the summer school. Instead of S1, one can propose a new Lacanian concept, which is S-1. So, but this is precisely what makes it worse. See, the S-1 sustains the S1 all the more. So, with the rigid end of history, which was proclaimed some 30 years ago, we're supposed to start living in post-ideological times, and the ideological illusions were gone, historically defeated, so the story went, and we're finally free to espouse reality without ideological bias and deception. And this maneuver, like 30 years ago, opened the field wide open for the proper critique of ideology. It looked like the vintage case, the textbook mechanism of ideology par excellence. But then this troubling development increasingly took place, too crude for the ideology critique to tackle. Namely that this ideological reality started to overtake the critique by its own exposure and using this exposure as the major asset of its deployment. Okay, I'm fully aware that highlighting this tendency, this meta shift whereby what is most on display is the most deceptive, this entails the danger of perpetuating this fascination with the figures like Trump. And I would just say that this is like the fascination with the fetish. This is, I think Slavoj already used this analogy, that the fetish, the last thing that one sees before envisaging the social antagonism that generated it, and that it veils through this apparent full exposure. And there is another danger of like nostalgia for the good old times of bourgeois ideology which presented this global spread of capitalist economy as objective reality, and then we could still deploy all these tricks of the critical theory. But it's the latter that generated the former, and the complacency of the left played a very large part in it. So the return to business as usual is the biggest delusion of all. And now, what do I have to propose? I don't know. I propose a return to Marx and Freud. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much for your paper. It was really great. I just had a question. I was listening to your paper and thinking about where you would put the place of force in this sort of picture. Because I was thinking about
The place of voice.
Force.
Force.
Yeah, because I was thinking about on the first model this idea of unveiling illusions, like taking away sort of in order to see truth. And I was thinking about, of course, the classic picture of Plato's, where the prisoner is not only just unshackled, but is dragged out by force from the cave in order to reach some kind of enlightenment. So once somebody is released, it's not an immediate kind of turn towards truth, but there has to be this kind of coercive process, right, where he's dragged, literally dragged physically and bodily out of this cave so that eventually he can see the truth. And I thought there might be an interesting way to think about how this kind of moment of coercion, in a sense, you must know, appears in an ideological form, right, in our society. So in a way, that kind of, being pushed towards the truth becomes, again, a kind of ideological maneuver. So I'm just thinking about all the things that we ought to know now. We ought to know, you ought to know about climate change. You ought to know about, we should all be aware of not only our political reality, but also even our, most intimate interior selves, right? So I was curious about where you would place this kind of mechanism of that moment of coercion of force.
Coercion of force. Well, you definitely have this moment in Plato's parable of the cave, where Plato is losing his nerve, as it were. He's not Socrates. I mean, Socrates would never do this. Socrates would just debate with people and rely on the idea that, everybody is endowed with reason, and surely if people will see the true state of affairs, they will also act accordingly. So Socrates had absolutely this enlightenment moment, firm belief of the enlightenment, that just the power of your reasoning is enough to liberate you. Plato, it was a slightly different case, and indeed there are moments where he's rather the enlightening minority having to enforce its thing in some way. And also, if you look at the Republic, where the guardians should enforce a certain policies. It's not enough just will people see by themselves. He's more pessimistic there than that. Well, okay, Socrates never wrote anything, so we have the suppositions of the Socratic doctrine, the rest of his basic stance. But this paradox that you described, that at some point people must be forced, this is actually what haunted the whole history of philosophy. And you have at the end, just before the French Revolution, in one of the most programmatic texts that was written at the time, which is Rousseau's Émile, as a treatise on education, then creation of a new man, and you have there a very famous sentence, on le forcera d'être libre. We will force him to be free. No. What is this poor Emile? I don't know. I always wondered how, if one were to actually implement or practice Rousseau's advice in Emile, that would certainly be catastrophic. It would produce psychotic subjects. But you have this same impatience in Rousseau. On le forcera d'être libre. The not quite relying on the natural light of. I think throughout history, I'm sure that one would find more cases of this thin line between relying on the natural light that everybody is endowed with and should be enough to debunk all illusions, and a certain enlightened minority which wants to impose different measures to spread the thing onto the masses, which wouldn't quite follow the light of reason by themselves. I think both things are part of this enlightenment project, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia, first. I'm trying to think about the link between what also kind of Alenka's paper and what you said, and I don't know how to frame this really, but I guess the simple question would be like, where is objet A in all this? And, in a sense, if you think about, if you think about, Lacan's reading, let's say, of Hamlet, and okay, Hamlet with all, from the king is dead to the king is a king of nothing, right? The whole, Lacan's focused on Ophelia, right? Kind of objet A and all of this that somehow brings together the entire story in a certain way. And I was just, I'm thinking about, so there's so much about S1. This is a great idea that, repression is what gets, repressed. Yes, I guess, is it still in the same logic of Alenka's kind of the perverts discourse, this kind of, that what we're getting is this kind of, the constant plugging of the lack in the other. There isn't, the other does not lack, there's a kind of a fullness to it, which is in your face, basically. And the question is, does objet A in this situation then, because you also said something really funny in Ljubljana, you said kind of Trump is a Lacanian. and so this kind of like, is objet A just kind of another one of the so-called names of the father now? And we need another thing, something else. I also think about Lacan's statement in 68 where he says, and I don't remember it in French now, but he says to the students, he says, no thing is all. And this is, I don't know, so do we, I don't know. So yeah, how does objet A work into this? Or does then the discourse of the analyst, the obverse side of the pervert's discourse now is completely complicit in this? Yeah.
Well, I finished the paper with a certain notion of the fetish. Trump precisely functioning as a sort of fetish, and very fascinating fetish. Everybody would want to speak about Trump. Everybody sees Trump. He's so much in the focus on display daily for the world audience now. This is as massive a fetish as we ever had somehow in political theory. And of course, in Lacanian theory, there's this profound divide between the object and the fetish. The fetish is precisely the obfuscation of the object. The fetish is the most visible thing, the thing that you cannot take your eyes away from. And look at Trump. This is the terrible thing. The moment he comes on television, there's too much of him. There's always too much of him. Whatever. You can't. He plays this. He's the sheer embodiment of a surplus, of an excess. And of course, the most visible thing, the way that he can steer the gaze, is, well, the object A would be at the opposite end. The object A is never on display. It's precisely that bug, the thing that drives us or distorts or whatever, or inspires passions, desires, insights, results, whatever, but which can never be on display. Which it is not something that would be a simple part of this world, which would be ontologically part of this world. It's always on the edge. It's always on the transition of the boundary between inside and outside. This is why extimacy, on the one hand, points to the object A. Is precisely the structure. I mean, the very structure of extimacy, das Unheimliche, is the pointer towards object A, and the fact that this obscenity is the negation of this structure. Because everything is on display. You turn the thing inside out. And what you see is massively the fetish. The fetish completely obfuscates the structure of extimacy. This as a beginning of an answer.
Okay, maybe I have actually a related question from a slightly different angle, but it's actually maybe about something that seems to be haunting the paper, but you didn't address explicitly, the question of anxiety. And in particular, I'm thinking of this anecdote in the anxiety seminar where Lacan sort of describes this game with the child where if you're wearing a mask and you reveal the mask, and play this peekaboo thing, the child is laughing. But the moment in which you take off your mask and there's only another mask behind the mask, of course the child is utterly terrified. And it was thinking in particular of the reading of the Poe story. In other words, what happens when precisely the character loses their anxiety about the disclosure of the thing that ought to be concealed? Right, so that in other words, this moment is precisely when no longer cares, right? When no longer is anxious about the disclosure of this thing that ought to remain hidden, to preserve their status. And so then, but at the same time, right? So I mean, I guess the larger question is, what happens to anxiety then, when in fact it seems to be absent, but at the same time, then it seems to be all the more generalized. So.
No, I think that one of the ways that some theorists, sociologists try to describe the present predicament, which is also a predicament of populism. Okay, Trump being this fetish object which somehow condenses all these things. One of the ways they try to describe it is the sort of manipulation of anxiety. There's a large amount of anxiety around, and one of the key things that all these populist leaders do is to work with anxiety and to steer it and to focus it and to give it a particular focus. Look, we have Mexicans will build a border. There are all these aliens, the refugees swamping Europe. The Muslims with these strange habits, they're getting us, our European culture is falling down. So you have a sort of a deflection of anxiety. You steer the anxiety onto the figure, certain figures of immigrants, others who are among us, who are already here and present constant threat. And there you have the leader who will protect you against this. This is the relief from anxiety. This is, I think, how the thing very basically works, the sort of canalization of anxiety. There's such a huge amount of anxiety around. And one of the basic tricks of populism is precisely this, to deflect the anxiety, to steer it and to focus it.
Yeah. Thank you, Milan. Completely in agreement with your paper, and also I'm just trying to think with you what would be the consequences for our practice of critique. I mean, I also agree we shall go back to Marx and Freud and reading, and it's a bit of a follow-up of my question the other day. If really, and I totally agree, we have a kind of, can say, Brechtian estrangement defect. It doesn't work. Reality has become that estranged world itself, and the unveiling itself is the last veiling or the last ideology trick. that we also we see the obscenity. We are powerless in facing that shamelessness that even shames us. But then, of course, we also need to redefine the stakes and maybe the practice of critique. I just think of two texts here. One would be, I think, Restoring the Truth, also by Bertolt Brecht, Wiederherstellung der Wahrheit, 5 problems, I think it's called. I think the last, which of course you mentioned courage and so on, the last one is cunning. And cunning is, I think, almost 70% of that short attempt of Brecht to break Nazi ideology. I think it's already written towards the mid-1930s. So the cunning would be a way of how we can conceal our speech of truth, that it's not part of that unveiling gesture. The other point would be, if everything works in favor of the sheer plenitude and surplus of that obscenity placed in front of your face, then a Brechtian or Benjaminian take on Brecht maybe is helpful, because Benjamin had the idea of kind of a doxological divestment or de-investment into the very circulations of opinions on what we see. So he basically says there are all these kind of worldviews, views, opinions, good, bad, or whatever, that only sustain precisely that world which cannot be corrected. Because there are no views that could correct that speech which has just been given by power. So one way would be, because we also cannot not talk to power, that's also the problem. We cannot get fully out of that Foucauldian idea of critique, that art of not being governed that way, but we still talk to governments, we still talk to governments, even though Beirut is a good example of at least trying not to talk to the representative of the regime. But still we talk somehow to it, but is there a kind of procedure, a reductive procedure that could deactivate that circulation? And I was thinking, if this is really the case of estrangement defect, how could we move from estrangement defect maybe to a doxological divestment and doxa defect? That the doxa cannot actually circulate so well anymore like a currency, because otherwise, of course, we can always try the withdrawal from the public sphere to read and we talk to each other, totally d'accord, but there is still a political practice outside, and of course we try not to play the game, or we're not trying to scandalize the shamelessness of those who are shameless. This is kind of a powerless gesture. So I just wonder how we could divest from, or deactivate, or just perform a kind of a doxa defect that, as you said, Trump or who else is always in your face. How not to respond to it in not a symmetric manner whatsoever. Just thinking further with your analysis, I totally agree to what could be a political strategy in these times.
Yes, well, I take this as a very valuable reflection on direction one should try to devise. I'm not sure I have any immediate suggestions as to this, but I would say you're mentioning the question of cunning, which Brecht underlined so much, particularly given the very drastic circumstances of a fascist regime. The utter cunning that one has to display and find in such situations. You have also the six rules of saying the truth. This is another. That's the one. That's the one. Okay. That's the one.
I think it's 5, or 6.
Maybe it's 5. 5 rules of saying the truth. Yeah.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah,
That's the one. Okay. Then I know what you're speaking about. No, it's a text which is which needs to be reread ever so many times. about the courage and the cunning of this, and sort of not so as not to espouse the one's moral indignation as the lever of this, because it's ever so much of moralistic discourse then immediately at hand. And of course, well, doxological divestment. I know what you're speaking about. How to divest the doxa, which is around. And it seems that the task is much harder than it was in Benjamin's time. But even Benjamin thought he was against enormous odds. But look at the social media. Look at the internet. I mean, doxological divestment. What does it mean? The doxa is around in such masses. It was never, ever, and incomparable in history. The circulation of the doxa. What do you do with Facebook and internet? I mean, we practice it daily. Somehow support the circulation of doxa. And the thing with which philosophy began, which is the difference between doxa and episteme, the knowledge, the opinion and knowledge, it's just vanishing. It's very hard to sustain in this absolute swamp of doxa. It's a swamp which was unimaginable even 20 years ago. It's really a very recent development, the proportions that it took. Okay, I'm of a certain age, actually going back to 68, as it were. So the development of 50 years after 68, it was completely unimaginable at the time. And even in you guys who are younger, you can see that what happened in the past 20 years is beyond what could imagine that 20 years ago. Precisely on this, the massive circulation of doxa. Divestment, I'm all for it. Yes, Vladimir.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful debate. I have actually two questions. The first one is, for me, it's very clear that your way to describe the function of ideology have some parallels with the Adornian way. Especially concerning fascism, because this idea, for example, of Glauben-los and Glauben, a belief that it's not exactly a belief, it's central to understand, for example, the level of identification, regime of identification between the mass and the leader in the fascist regime, at least for Adorno. But there is one notion, and this is the question that I'd like to ask you, because the Frankfurt School, they insist that there is also a kind of desire for revolt that is inside this identification. The fascist leader is able to give body to a revolt against order and against the law. Even if the revolt against the law inside the law, even if the revolt against the order, but inside the order. But the question is why they were able to, in a certain way, monopolize this desire for, the social desire for revolt. And maybe this is a question also to put in the Trump's system too. And the second one is, if I can just take the question of searching again, it's really very impressive how these types of leaders like Trump or Berlusconi and so on, they use a very strong state violence, much stronger than before. And there is a real structure of force that is applied against all the possible, let's say, revolts we are seeing in France, for example, and in many other countries. And my second question will be, why don't ask also again which type of force, of counter force we should develop, because the discussion just in the level of the ideology sometimes seems that we can just make a kind of counter position in the rhetorical way. But why not talk against about the legitimate use of force and violence against this type of situation?
Well, thank you. First, regarding Adorno and the question of this Glaubenlose Glaube, I think it's absolutely essential because in the paper from 51 or whatever, the Freudische Theorie und die Struktur der faschistischen Propaganda, I think it's called, he has actually a very enlightening passage where he speaks about the structural belief in fascism. On the face of it, those people fanatically believe in the Führer and etc., these fanatic masses. And he somehow puts this into question. He says, well, the problem is that they don't actually think that the Führer is the magician, the Jews are the devil. That somehow there is a reflected thing. Deep down, they don't really think that. So there's a fake manifestation of support and belief, etc., which makes it worse. I mean, the fact that there's no sort of immediate belief in the Führer makes it worse because they have to stage their belief in a more forceful manner. No? This makes it more pernicious. The fake beliefs are worse than the true beliefs. If we are dealing with some true believers, even in false things or whatever, that's easier. The moment you have fake belief, you have this in Adorno. The question of the fakery at the very basis of this seemingly very committed following of fascism. And the desire for revolt. Of course, I think that one of Trump's major successes was exactly the incapacity of the Democratic Party and the whole left to canalize or to be able to come up with a certain platform for revolt. And revolt was, we had this crisis in 2008, which is the biggest economic crisis in history, and the massive state intervention, which, by people who swear by the free market. The free market, we should just leave it to the free market and then things will turn fine. Those are the people who made a state intervention that the left would never ever dare to do or come anywhere near this kind of massive state intervention. And of course state intervention is public money which was then shifted on the shoulders of the population, and there was seriously a revolutionary situation. The rage that came out in Europe and in America, the enraged middle classes and the working class, and there was no left who could steer this revolt. And then comes Trump, who says that I'm the anti-establishment person. I'm the person you've been looking for. I'm the revolt against the establishment. This massive private corporate brand, Trump, now masquerading as the sort of, in the Freudian scenario of the murder of the primal father. No? Trump is the oldest brother who leads the gang in the attack against the alleged Washington father, whatever. No? So yes, the capacity of steering this revolt, of canalizing, of finding a way to steer this rage, that was the essential factor, and this is absolutely the failure of the left. Because if there ever, the situation of 2008, the crush of the proportions of the crush of the system, there should be the wet dreams of the left. This is what we've been waiting for. We always said that the system will crash. It's inevitable. This will come to a huge crisis. And the crisis comes, and the one who is the most surprised by it is the left. He doesn't have an answer at all. What the hell should we do? Now, and who doesn't? And then it's like in Wagner you have die Wunde schließt der Speer nur, der sie schlug. The wound can be closed only by the what? The spear that opened it. No? So then you have the neoliberals saying, let's close the wound by the spear that actually inflicted the wound. So this was the structure of the response after 2008. And as to the use of violence, well, I will point out just that, it's been pointed out now a number of times, also by the leftists, the use of state violence, of course, in Trump. But let's not pin it to Trump. It's been pointed out that Trump is the only American president in living memory for a very long time who didn't start a war. Look at Obama, the question of state violence. Look at Bush, okay, it's another category. No? So everybody was kind of involved in these foreign invasions and invested in all kinds of things. And back to Kennedy, who started the Vietnam War. Well, Trump didn't start any war so far. Although we all the time seem to be in a sort of state of exception. Expecting this moment that he might push the red button. He's crazy enough to do it. So there's this imagery behind this. So just a warning about the perception of what is state violence. There was a lot of state violence under Obama, but he was somehow seen as the good guy. And yes, as to the edge of your question, yes. It's difficult to respond to this, but yes, considering also the use of violence shouldn't be a taboo, to say it in one word. Okay. There may be.
No, I can ask you the pause as well.
I think we are behind schedule at this point.
Sorry,
We are.
you can ask a question.
Oh, sure, no.
Well, okay, then go very quickly. Of course, I go along with the talk. It's more about something that you said in the discussion that relates to the question of anxiety and force. I was wondering, is it really anxiety that the populists are causing? It is the central question of affects that are generated by populists as a strategy. But I was wondering if one shouldn't mobilize a Nietzschean notion of resentment, ressentiment, because it's more about presenting figures which tie rage, which tie aggressivity, and one could also say, of course, they're also not only causing ressentiment, but also outrage with the liberal elites, which are completely disarmed how to react to this obscene figure, and then you have through the encouragement of ressentiment also a systematic invitation to people running amok, to people just going on the street and start shooting. It just happened in Germany, and I wouldn't say that these people feel anxiety or act out of anxiety. They act out of aggressivity, which is systematically generated, and we are living in a system that's running amok. And the question of force, very quickly, Lacan, since you ended with the return to Freud, Lacan said once that analysis consists in carefully dosing anxiety, because it's kind of pushing people to act. And also in front of the students, he said, you are all here, and you're pouring in my seminar because, in a way, I'm making you feel ashamed. I'm causing shame. So these are two forms of violence that seem to kind of invite to action, but in a different manner than ressentiment or, outrage. So I was just wondering if...
No, I agree. Well, I think that aggressivity... No, I agree with the point on resentment, which is maybe in itself already a management of anxiety. I don't know if it's of a completely different kind of order of things. Maybe the resentment is canalization of a certain feeling of anxiety. And yes, I agree that the flip side of this resentment is a call towards aggressivity, but which is again sort of a manipulation of anxiety, I think, which is again a sort of finding an outlet for this, showing an outlet for anxiety. And as to Lacan's idea of shame as a positive, actually, trigger, of course I agree with this. It was a great moment, which could, was held against Lacan, the way he responded to this student revolt. But in retrospect, you can see it was a great moment of reflection at that time. It was very hard, very difficult to give this kind of reflection at a moment when everything called for enthusiasm.
We've gone over time, sorry.
We are.
So we have a coffee break and come back to the next time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.